Displeased, Guide Alexander Page tapped his fingers on the surface of the metal table he sat upon, biting the joint of the thumb on his other hand as he tried to force himself to focus. Time was running short, and he needed to finish this soon. With the galactic core being as cramped as it was, it would barely take Brother Anders a day to reach his destination, ready to take the leading step in a dangerous dance with destiny, right on the razor's edge. And when that moment came, Alexander would have to be ready to clear the way for him. He owed him that much, both for his honor as a guide, and based on his simple honor as a man. Still, it was easier said than done. After all, they had an entire army to contend with at this point. An entire army that was quite adamant about knowing exactly who moved in or out of that station, and would be very unhappy about Anders' arrival. Even though official statements had never been made, it was nigh impossible to believe that reason would not have dug most of their names out of some crevice at this point. Couple that with the fact that the smarter ones of the misguided had started to see through the guise of his guidance, and you got a quite unpleasant obstacle to try and find your way around. And as if that wasn't enough, they would soon also have to be ready for their base of operations to be compromised. With the High Matriarch's arrest, it was only a matter of time until the galactic investigators would come knocking on her estate with a warrant in their hand. For the time being, Osnajar's ancient and in parts quite complex and long-winded bureaucracy still laid a couple of stones in the way of those investigations, especially since their target was the highest rank of the planet's aristocracy. However, unless something drastic happened, that could only stall the interstellar machine for so long. That being said, something drastic was most certainly on the horizon. Alexander could feel it, smell it, taste it even. He was not in the know. He had not been informed about anything yet. However, someone like High Matriarch Tua would not have set herself into motion and pushed into enemy lines unless she was planning something big. She had the contacts. She had the influence. The question was only how she planned to use it, and how it would play into Alexander's cards. Our assumption was right. A slightly distorted voice suddenly came through a radio that laid face up on the table, not far from where the guy's fingers were rhythmically hammering on its surface. The voice was Brother Abbott's. Unlike the almost disturbingly technophilic friar, Alexander couldn't remain in the cold of the repurposed freezer they were keeping their most valuable weapon in for hours on end. Every now and then, he needed to warm his hands up and stretch out his legs, and with things as sensitive as they were right now, he took the radio with him every time he did, just so that Abbott would have a way to reach him should something important arise. They started filtering their more important calls through the maw of the beast itself. Abbott continued his report, without waiting for any sign of life from Alexander's side. Obviously, it won't be fooled by any injection we can make right now. In fact, even trying a little too hard may just reveal us in a moment, if our scent is caught for but a breath. We have to consider increasing the performance once again. Alexander sighed, and stopped his drumming for a moment to reach for the radio. The joint of his thumb slipped out from in between his teeth, as his cool fingers slid up to his forehead, feeling like icicles as they pressed against his skin that had heated up severely from his strenuous concentration. Would it really make a difference? Being but men, they could merely play at monstrosity however much they wanted. Ultimately, they could only scratch the surface of what a true creature of entropy would be capable of. And that wasn't just considering the one they had to actively work against. How much more performance can you actually get out of it? Alexander wondered, finally pressing down the send button to reply to Abbott's report, his voice low and pondering. Oh, we still have quite a way up to go, Abbott replied, with amused confidence. Despite everything that was happening, the brother still seemed about as unflappable as he had always been. Admirable, in a way. How he was so endlessly assured of the path he walked. We just have to take the right steps. But it also brought up the question, how sure you should be. At what point did it become dangerous not to question what you were doing anymore? And how much difference do you think it would make against the actual realized? Alexander questioned further, removing his hand from his head to press it flatly onto the table, supporting his weight on it as he leaned back. "You said yourself that it was unlikely you could ever compete with the real deal, even remotely." There was a slight laugh on the other side of the line. "I did say that," Abbott confirmed, his amusement not waning in the slightest. "And I still believe that to be true, for the most part. However, back then I didn't yet truly understand what we were dealing with." Although he was alone, Alexander gave the speaker an incredulous look, lifting an eyebrow at the statement. "And now?" he wondered, not certain exactly what they were dealing with, which Abbott had any chance to misjudge. "Do you think the realized is less capable than you originally anticipated?" Abbott's voice came through in a slight scoff. "No," he said. For the first time there was no active amusement in his tone. Although it remained quite casual, he at least seemed to be serious for the moment. "I'm afraid it is every bit as dangerous as everyone already knows. Possibly even more so." Alexander suppressed his impulse to ask what Abbott was talking about then. He didn't feel like he should have to drag the brother through this conversation by his ear. "It was our own capabilities that I wasn't previously aware of," Abbott finally clarified, once he seemingly realized that Alexander's silence was an invitation to keep explaining. "I knew that the marvel was formidable, but now that I had the chance to spend some time immersing myself deep in its bowels, I am beginning to see the true power that slumbers beneath the surface of broken circuits and jumbled bytes." A cloud spread over Alexander's mind, and his face darkened while he listened to the friar's words. "The marvel?" he asked, his voice filled with more than a hint of disapproval. It was the first time he had heard Abbott, or anyone for that matter, refer to the pile of now literally glorified scrap in that manner. He wondered if Abbott realized just what he was praising there. Of course, there was a dumb question to ask himself. Abbott knew of the thing better than any of them, which, however, made his words all the stranger. Of course, it wasn't news to Alexander that Abbott had been fascinated with that apparatus from the very moment they had discovered it. It had always been a curiosity to him, a powerful tool that he could learn more about to make more effective use of it. A riddle to sink his teeth into, working away until he would crack it wide open. All things that the friar had enjoyed doing with various items in the past. However, this near reverence his words sounded of now, that was certainly new. "I have nothing else to call it at this point," Abbott replied, seemingly unperturbed by the tone of Alexander's voice. In fact, the way he spoke was quite candid towards explaining himself. "I guess you could also call it a miracle, though I believe that would be reaching a bit far. Still, it is unique in its prestigiousness, unlike any other machine ever conceived, at least as far as we know. What would I call it if not a marvel of engineering?" Alexander couldn't quite help himself and scoffed slightly. The marvelling words of Abbott starkly contrasting with his own pictures and recollections of the damned thing. "It's a heap of scrap that we dug out of a half-melted server." He countered Abbott's praise with a shake of his head. "Sure, it's got a lot of processing power, but that's hardly worth such acclamation." He remembered that day quite well. It had been quite impactful, despite its broken nature after all. It was back when they had briefly found refuge on a spacious ship, slowly making their way to pierce the veil of their own sun's systems. With the way it had been blocked off by the UHSDS forces for the longest time, jumping directly from anywhere within the system would have been a one-way ticket into being either quickly detained or immediately erased from existence via an induced hyperspace collapse. They had to take it slow, gaining a bit of distance from the watchful ships at below light speeds first, before they would quickly stutter out of the fleet's reach in multiple quick jumps. And, of course, they had to be incredibly watchful as they tried to reach the right portion for that. After all, UHSDF, scouts and outposts weren't exactly known for being easy to spot. One constantly had to keep their eyes open if he didn't want to be accidentally caught in their web. However, what their many scans and careful prods ultimately found out there, silently clinging to the broken and misshapen remains of a former dwarf planet that had lost any hint of its form after being torn asunder by forces far greater than the gravitational pull previously keeping it together, was not something created by human hands. They had descended onto the debris to investigate the strange, seemingly alien structure that lay hidden so far out, barely in the reaches of their own home. Its casing, for a lack of a better term, had been cracked open, presumably during the same event that had destroyed the planetoid in the first place. Beneath it, the insides had been revealed to the view of their lights. Even as a layman, Alexander had been able to tell at a glance that it must have once been an enormous computer-like structure, though large parts of its innards had obviously melted, fused together, and turned entirely useless as a result. They were just heaps of malformed sludge of metal and polymer now. Wasn't the shot that did it? Alexander could still hear Abbott's crackling voice, explaining through their comm line, as the friar dove into the cracked exterior to take a closer look at the melted mess. It melted from the inside, likely after the atmosphere dispersed. If you ask me, it couldn't get rid of the heat fast enough in a vacuum. Back then, Alexander's face had scrunched up at the thought. It produced enough heat to cause that? He had asked in slight disbelief, as he took another glance at the sludge-like leftovers of what had likely been a sophisticated machine. A computer that can melt itself to such a degree had sounded odd to him back then. Well, who knows what it was trying to compute? Abbott had simply given back with an audible shrug back then, right before he crawled deeper into the machine. Looks like not everything pulled the trigger though. Some parts still look good. Maybe a safety switched on at some point. Alexander craned his neck all the way back to look up at the structure. Any idea what it might be? He had asked, wondering just who would install something like that all the way out here. Hard to say just by looking at it. However... Abbott had responded, and then paused a brief moment to poke his head out of the casing again, quickly looking down at the floating debris they were standing on. I can't think of too many systems that would have drawn this kind of relativity fire. The brother's mention was casual, however its implication had instantly caused Alexander's eyes to widen, as he suddenly stared upon the structure before him with a new sense of deep-seated dread emerging in his gut. It can't be, he released slightly breathlessly, as he near stumbled a step back, not taking his eyes off the structure for a moment. You think it's... in all his nuts and bolts. Abbott confirmed his suspicions, at least insofar that he, too, believed this was likely exactly what Alexander thought it was. A leftover of the greatest threat to mankind which had ever emerged into the law's creation. A misstep of mere men daring to toe the line into his domain. A forgotten shard of humanity's firstborn, Michael. A being so vast that apparently not even humanity's combined efforts have been able to truly wipe it off the face of existence in its entirety. That's what we thought when we first scratched it out of its burned shell. Abbott replied to Alexander's earlier ridicule, quite suddenly yanking the guide back into the present. Can't blame us, really. The only thing we had to compare it to, even remotely, was just a very big computer made for very big processes. And it's certainly smaller enough to be confused for such to our unrefined senses. And it's certainly similar enough to be confused for such to our unrefined senses. Alexander's scowl deepened as Abbott went on. A part of him didn't like the way the man spoke right now at all. Care to skip to the point? He requested calmly, despite the snide choice of words. Although he didn't see it, he could picture Abbott giving one of his single nods before his inner eye, as the brother paused a brief moment. It's not like the servers he had on Earth, Abbott finally clarified. And thankfully, his voice dipped away from the way it appreciated the machine a little too deeply earlier, returning to a more pragmatic way of speaking, explaining things in a matter-of-fact way to his less knowledgeable guide. Not a vessel he simply appropriated to house himself and run whatever programs he needed to try and tear the children of God apart most efficiently. Both its construction and its inner workings are entirely alien to anything a human would build. Based on things and systems we created, sure. It was what he had to work with, after all. But apart from the basic frameworks, it's something he constructed himself, specifically to suit his very own personal needs. Whatever those may have been. "And you want to increase his performance?" Alexander questioned in slight agitation before he could truly stop himself from bursting out like that. For all his differences with certain parties pulling the strings of their home, he was still human. Of course, he couldn't deny that he had opened the door to this beast when he had first agreed to make use of this relic of darker times to try and create a brighter future. However, then his understanding had been that it was merely a discarded tool with some faint, leftover sparks of power. Not Michael's very own creation of likely destruction. Abbott seemingly couldn't help but laugh at Alexander's outburst, a deep snickering escaping the radio. "You can calm yourself, Guy Page," he assured quickly, somewhat fighting down his amusement to try and give honest reassurance. "Just because it was a little more personal to that beast doesn't make it any less dead. Tinkerer or not, Michael is gone. All that changed is that he left us a finger rather than a nail." Alexander released a long breath, still feeling his heart pound against his ribcage. Still pushing down his brief, sparking panic, he soon had to admit that Abbott was right. What was dead simply didn't return to life, no matter how many traces it may have left behind in the world of the living. "You are right. Excuse me. I think the stress is getting to me," he apologized, running a hand through his hair. If Michael was alive in there, they themselves would have stopped being quite a while ago. "Can't fault you for that," Abbott responded. "And I also can't disagree that using anything of Michael's certainly feels like it's approaching a line we may not want to cross. However, I don't think we are there quite yet. At least, not considering what is on the line." He paused briefly, a moment of silence falling over the conversation. Then, he more reservedly added, "Though I believe it would be wise to refer to your guidance on this matter. Since Anders only has the highest opinions of you, it may be time that I too refer to the way you point me. At the very least, a second opinion on whether it's worth it can never hurt." Alexander swallowed heavily. His pulse picked up a bit as he let everything go through his mind. Suddenly, his eyes were blinded so that he had to squint them shut and avert his gaze down. Thick clouds that had previously blocked out the bright light of the star that Oshnajar orbited from, falling through the glass ceiling above him, had suddenly moved out of the way, leaving its shining rays to burn right down into his eyes. It stung, and he had to rub his eyes to try and recover, seeing bright dots burned into his vision, even as he kept them shut tight. Meanwhile, the rays' heat spread across his skin, warming up even his cold hands, which had felt like a dead man's, ever since he had last left the freezer Abbott was still residing in. Still keeping his eyes closed for a bit, he held his hands out, opening and closing them slowly as he felt warmth return to them through the star's bright light. Then, slowly, he blinked his eyes open again, though still squinting as he carefully adjusted to the bright shine. With his gaze still lowered, the first thing that caught his eyes, once he truly opened them to see again, was the glimmer of the golden symbol around his neck, the polished metal twinkling as it caught the light. Carefully, he moved his hand back to reach for it. Unlike his usual iron grip, he simply lifted it slightly, with the very tips of his fingers, tilting it up to look at it. The symbol of the sun failed through pride, and the Lord failed through flesh, combined into an eternal reminder that nothing in creation, not even the greatest pieces of the Creator himself, could escape their own fallibility. "You are sure it isn't dead?" he questioned the more knowledgeable man once again. Despite his own acknowledgements, he couldn't help but ask one more time. Nothing that died could come back to life, but how assured could he be about something that wasn't truly alive in the first place? "Absolutely," Abbott replied without hesitation. "It is just a very powerful computer now. The algorithms that are left over are akin to twitching muscles, not actual thought." Alexander nodded. "And you believe it can help us combat our new beast effectively?" he asked. After all, he had to admit, they were running short on effective weapons against more than just one of their opponents. Having an actual ace would be much needed relief. His thoughts wandered to Brother Anders for a moment. The man was up against a saint. In the Friar's own evaluation, even against a true saint, rivaling the ones of legend. And although that assessment was certainly questionable, Aldrin was at the very least a similarly frightening kind of opponent. But he was still a man, if they could only focus on him. "I cannot guarantee anything," Abbott replied honestly and outright. "However, from all I can tell, it has never tinkered with anything like this of its own. Therefore, it will at the very least be something she has never dealt with before." Alexander shifted his lips. "What do you promise yourself from increasing the performance?" he inquired, for a bit more detail. He could hear Abbott exhale through his nose. "We still won't be able to compete with it on any wider scale. Things are simply too mismatched for that. But, since it is trimmed for extreme efficiency of AI specifically, and it should be something completely alien to that beast, I might be able to use it to overwhelm the realized in specific areas. Pierce its walls with a concentrated puncture instead of flat pressure." He explained his plan, sounding about semi-sure that he could actually pull it off. "We would, of course, have to use it for the right purpose, make it count before the beast has a chance to adapt." Alexander blew a breath sharply out of his nose. He removed his hand from his pendant and fell backwards, catching himself with both hands, as he leaned back and looked up at the now bright sky through the glass ceiling. For a moment, he imagined the saint, sitting right here where he was, looking up at the same sky. He even lifted one of his hands away from the table's plate, intending to hide it behind his back, before he quickly pushed against that impulse, deciding it was in too bad a taste. Still, he imagined it. In the not-too-distant past, St. Aldwyn had been confined to this very estate. At some point, he may have also sat here and just pondered. Back then, Alexander himself had still been a quite different man. He was young, well, only a year younger in reality, but it felt much longer than that somehow. He had still been idealistic. For a while, he had actually bought what the High Matriarch had been selling. A human ambassador who, after suffering a fateful attack of one of his own people, had destined himself to connect humanity to a deeper truth of the cosmos. An attempt to lead his people into a blissful peace and order that had been denied to their own world for so many eons. Alexander had been excited back then. There was no point in denying it. Just like the saint, but unlike many of the others, most of the priests and friars he worked and surrounded himself with included, he had been born only after the first contact to the rest of the galaxy had been made. And as one of the galactic generation, Alexander effectively grew up learning two separate sets of history, that of Earth and that of everything else. It was easy enough to say that he had found one of the two to be far more successful than the other, and originally he had thought the same was true for Aldwyn. Admittedly, it had been naive. "Alright, how do you propose we increase the performance?" Alexander questioned further, his mind fully opened up to the idea now. "You said we would have to take the right steps." The radio was quiet for a few moments, as Abbott hesitated for a bit before he replied, Well, it would have likely caused protests until recently, but with Tua flown from the coop, I believe we might be able to get it done without much hassle. Of course, he was being vague once again. However, this time, Alexander figured he had enough context to make an educated guess. So, you will just connect it to larger systems, he assumed. Honestly, he had expected something slightly more sophisticated when it was described as taking the right steps. But in the end, more processing power was likely just that. More processing power. Yeah, basically, Abbott continued. This estate does have a quite impressive internal server after all. Alexander lifted an eyebrow. But isn't that server also completely isolated? He wondered, remembering that this place was built with the idea of its systems not being infiltrated from the outside very much in mind. It's hard to isolate from plugging something in, Abbott countered, an audible smirk finally having returned into his voice. And the Marvel itself has all the connections we need. For just a second, Alexander reflected on that, and on the craziness of this entire situation. Was he really about to give one of his subordinates the go-ahead to connect the corpse of humanity's greatest adversary to a secure, isolated system, in order to put enough life back into it so that it may give them the change to stand against something that would become a far greater threat if they did not intervene? Originally, he had come into the running for the position of the guide, precisely because of his young age and dedication. He was picked as someone who could navigate this new world everyone found themselves in, as someone who grew up in it. Someone who could see through the obstacles that both Earth and space provided, and could find the path through them. He had been pushed for the role harder after the incident here on Osnajar, after the Saint had first started to show his true colours, had first stepped in front of the galaxy, poising and posturing himself, and humanity by unwanted and unsolicited extension, as those who would accept all comers, as those who saw the world differently from the rest of the galaxy. Those who would go against that established order that had held for so long, so much longer than any peace on Earth had lasted. It had been quite the punch to the gut for Alexander back then, when the man he had thought to be of one mind with himself turned out to be the exact opposite. It was, by far, the greatest disappointment he had felt in his young years. However, it had also opened a door for him. The door to those who wished to take humanity in, to help him show them the way to the safe path. They weren't perfect, of course, but that was what he, as the guide, was there for. To lead around the dangerous parts of the road, steer to those that had peace at their end. Do it, he finally stated, renewed resolve igniting in his heart as he remembered those times in which he, alone, saw the truth of the danger ahead. He alone had the vision to see just how much of a threat that man would become. Get it as much power as you possibly can. We are going to need it for what lies ahead. Back then, most had seen James simply as one of the misguided. A hurt man trying to make sense of the world by lashing out against those who wounded him in whatever way he could. Alexander remembered those days, as Abbott replied with an enthusiastic, "Yes, Guard Page, but are you sure you can approve of that?" People had not seen it as he did, had not seen the long path that Alduin was running down, even back then. They had focused on other things, seen threats in other corners. That was, of course, until... "Better the devil you know," Alexander confirmed for Abbott, deciding to trust that vision that had steered him right in the past. He saw the danger back then, he would see it now. If we are to fight this evil, we will have to bring every weapon we can muster. Anything else will be a disservice to our good people. The clear message returned to his mind. Alexander was right. It had echoed for all of their networks, being whispered by every pair of lips in the faith. Alduin had gone off the deep end, far further than anyone but him had been able to tell. He had dug deep into insanity, and came out with the closest thing one could do to making an actual deal with the devil. In his blinded zealotry to be the bigger man, Saint Alduin had reached down into the abyss, yelling out the question of just how far he could go, only to find that the abyss smiled back. "You are right, Guy Page," Abbott said. At that moment, his voice was just like those of the fathers had been when they had come to inform Alexander of his new title. A sound of understanding and respect, even a bit of veneration, but also the very clear tone of empathy, and an underlying pity for the task that would be ahead of him. Of them all. This conflict had become about so much more than simply the safe path of the guide against the lethal path of a saint. Or, more precisely, the paths had grown into so much more than the simple roads they tried to get people to travel. Alexander tried to keep his cool at all times. He knew it was important to do so, to see things clearly, to keep his eye out for obstacles. He knew raving like a madman, and trying to get everyone to see what he saw through insistence alone, would yield only stubbornness and resistance. He was the guide. He had to be calm. He had to be assured that he knew the way. Only then would people confidently follow. However, he could see it. See the fork in the road. This was no longer a difference of paths that ultimately wished to reach the same destination, with the only difference being the way they took to get there. These paths had entirely diverged. Walking one road, there was he. Its end, a galaxy united. A peace long-lasting like humanity could only dream of in all its years. A solution to the problems that plagued them. Something that had functioned for longer than their own people could even travel the stars. And on the other, there was the Saint. Its end. The greatest force of war and destruction that anything in creation had known, re-emerging into existence once again through the reckless and blind help of the very beings it sought to destroy. Not a path of safety against one of danger, but a path of prosperity against one of annihilation. The guide was meant to, well, guide. To show the way. Bring people onto the right path and allow them to walk themselves. To point in the right direction if they strayed. However, sometimes, a shepherd's crook had to be more than a mere walking aid. Sometimes guidance needed to be more firm. And sometimes the herd had to be defended, lest they all fall prey to the dangers of the world. Sometimes guidance needed to be more firm, and sometimes the herd had to be defended, lest they all fell prey to the dangers of the world. Anything else, yes, anything else would truly be a disservice. Pressing down the send button one last time, he lifted the radio back to his mouth. "Do you need any help with setting it up?" As the large door to the airlock finally opened, Nafmir Duralfriend lifted his head slightly out of reflex, only to then quickly lower it again, when he realized that his guest would be on the far smaller side. His flapping ears soon picked up on the odd sound of something hard, clacking against the station's floor in regular intervals, though his eyes needed a moment to follow the sound and pinpoint what was little more than a blurry, moving speck to his vision right now. Luckily, the odd shape of this speck and the peculiarity of its movement still quite clearly identified it as just the right speck he had been waiting for, even among all the others flooding into the station along with it. Of course, the various new arrivals were all quickly greeted by the awaiting soldiers, who swiftly dispersed to make sure none of them would slip through the cracks without being processed first. They wanted a tight lockdown on anyone who would come or go. And so one of them also soon approached his awaited speck, releasing a surprised noise almost immediately once he finally took a good look at who he was dealing with there. It seemed someone had gotten a bit too comfortable in his position. The Estes-sized soldier took a half step back and reached for one of the stopping weapons on the belt around his waist. Meanwhile, the much smaller Sippersling, who had given him such a fright, simply seemed to stand there, unimpressed, while he awaited whatever orders would be yelled at him. You are... the SSI yelled out, but seemingly forgot to finish his sentence as he fished out the maze from his belt to point it at the small Deathworlder. Warrant Officer Reprig, yes. the Sippers then confirmed, in a nasal and slightly annoyed tone, while he leaned his weight onto the crutch under his arm. And since you are obviously thinking it, yes, there used to be a warrant for my arrest as well. The SSI seemed a bit blindsided by that, especially from the casual way the Deathworlder was talking about his own arrest. Used to? He finally asked, after a few long moments of dumb staring. Used to, Reprig confirmed with a nod that made his short trunk wiggle a bit. I have been officially cleared to go undetained for the time being, by the human forces who demanded my arrest themselves. He sighed a bit as he repositioned himself to lean onto his crutch, even more comfortably. Of course, I don't expect you to just believe that. I will wait patiently for you to confirm as much. Just, please, don't spray me with that, he explained, briefly nodding towards the high-pressure spray bottle that was still pointed in his direction. As the soldier mumbled something under his breath, and slowly allowed the maze to sink down, Reprig lifted his head. Obviously, he had absolutely no problem spotting the enormous Sotiatos ball waiting for him. This might take a minute, he warned half-heartedly, the tuft on the end of his tail swishing left to right. I suppose we will have to take that time, Nuthmid Orphan replied. He was young, after all. Patience he had in abundance.